The day he moved into his new house felt like the beginning of a dream. For years he had imagined waking up to the gentle sound of water and stepping outside to see a calm lake stretching out in front of him. The house was not the biggest in the neighborhood, and it wasn't filled with luxury or fancy things. But it had something he valued far more than marble floors or chandeliers. Right behind it, connected directly to the property, stood a small wooden dock that touched the edge of the shimmering lake. That dock was everything to him. It was a piece of peace he had longed for, a place where he could sit quietly with a fishing rod or watch the sun set in warm colors over the water. He had worked for this moment all his life, and now it was finally his. When he first walked through the front door with the keys in his hand, he almost couldn't believe it belonged to him. He had rented small apartments for years, each one, with thin walls where he could hear neighbors arguing or loud traffic rushing outside his window. Every month, he had put away a little money, often denying himself small luxuries like vacations or new gadgets, because he was saving for something bigger. Many people had told him that a dream home by the water was out of reach, that only the wealthy could afford it. But he had proved them wrong. After years of careful planning, long hours of work and patience, he had found a house that wasn't too big, wasn't too expensive, but had the one thing he wanted most. The dock looked like it had been there for decades. It was strong, though weathered, with planks that had turned a soft gray from the sun. The first time he stepped onto it, he felt the wood creak slightly under his feet, and he smiled, imagining how many mornings he would stand there with a cup of coffee, staring at the calm ripples spreading across the lake. The water caught the sunlight in sparkling flashes, and he thought it was more beautiful than anything money could buy. He imagined himself bringing his small boat, tying it to the side of the dock, and taking it out for slow rides when he needed to clear his mind. He pictured quiet evenings, maybe with a book in his hand, while the sky turned pink and orange above him. That dock wasn't just wood and nails to him, it was the heart of his new life. He spent his first evening walking around the property, running his hand along the fence, opening and shutting each window, as if trying to make the house truly his. Everything smelled new to him, even though the house was old. It had a comforting scent of wood and earth, mixed with the faint freshness of lake air that drifted in whenever he left a window open. The silence was also something he noticed right away. Unlike the busy city where he used to live, this place was calm. There were no honking cars, no neighbors shouting, no endless construction noises. Instead, there were crickets singing in the background and the faint splash of water against the shore. Inside the house was modest but cozy. The living room had a big window that faced the water, and he immediately knew it would become his favorite spot inside the house. He placed a chair near the window that very night so that he could sit and look out whenever he wanted. The kitchen was small but practical, the bedroom simple but filled with natural light. It was enough for him. He wasn't looking for a mansion. He was looking for peace, and this house gave him exactly that. On his second day, he woke up before sunrise. The excitement of living there still hadn't settled, and he felt like a child on the morning of a holiday. Out. Without even making breakfast, he went straight to the dock. The air was cool, and the lake was covered with a thin mist that made everything look like a dream. He breathed deeply, filling his lungs with fresh, damp air, and thought about how different it was from the dusty, polluted air of the city. He sat down on the edge of the dock, letting his legs dangle above the water, and listened to the soft sounds of nature. Ducks swam across the lake, leaving ripples behind them, and somewhere far away, a bird sang as if announcing the morning. For the first time in years, he felt like he could finally relax. The stress of work, bills, traffic, and noise, all of it seemed far away here. He didn't have to rush, didn't have to prove anything to anyone. He had already won the battle by making it to this point. This dock was proof of his effort, and sitting there gave him a sense of calm that money alone could never buy. He thought about how many mornings he would repeat this ritual. Maybe even invite friends over someday to fish with him or have small gatherings by the water. It wasn't just a home, it was a new life. He also began imagining little details about his future here. Perhaps he would get a small grill and cook outside on warm summer nights. Maybe he would add flower pots near the entrance of the dock, giving it a brighter look. He thought about painting the railings or sanding the planks, not because it needed it, but because he wanted to leave his mark on the place. Every idea filled him with excitement. For once, life didn't feel like a constant race. It felt like something to enjoy slowly. Neighbors had waved at him politely when he first moved in. Some smiled, some just nodded, but he thought they all seemed decent enough. It felt like a community where people minded their own business but weren't unfriendly. That suited him perfectly. He didn't want drama. He wanted peace. At that moment, he believed he had chosen the right place, far away from chaos, where no one could disturb his quiet life. That evening, he sat on the dock again, this time with a cup of tea. The water reflected the golden sky, and as he watched it, he felt grateful. He thought about the long path it took him to get there, the sacrifices, the years of saying no to things he wanted, the struggles of city life. All of it was worth it. Sitting there with the soft sound of water and the fading light around him, he promised himself he would never take it for granted. The dock, the house, the lake, this was the peace he had always wanted. And now it was his. He went to bed that night with the windows open, the cool air drifting inside, and the gentle sound of crickets singing him to sleep. For the first time in a very long time, he slept deeply, without worry. He didn't know what challenges might come in the future, and at that moment he didn't care. All he knew was that he had found his place, and he felt safe, happy, and free. Only a few days had passed since he had moved into his dream home, when something happened that disturbed the peace he had been enjoying. He had just begun to feel settled, arranging his furniture, planting a few flowers near the porch, and creating a daily routine of morning coffee on the dock. It was during one of those early days that he heard a knock at his door. First, he thought it might be a neighbor coming to welcome him, perhaps offering a friendly smile or even a small gift, the way new neighbors sometimes do. But when he opened the door, he didn't find a warm greeting. Instead, he found a group of people standing together, their expressions stiff and serious, their tone unfriendly. They introduced themselves as members of the Homeowners Association. HOA. He had heard the term before, but didn't know much about their rules. He assumed they were there to talk about simple matters, maybe to hand over a list of community guidelines like trash pickup schedules or maintenance reminders. Instead, the first words out of their mouths shocked him. They pointed toward the dock and told him it had to go. Not later, not in a few months, but immediately. For a moment, he thought he had misheard them. Why would anyone want to take away the dock? It wasn't broken, it wasn't unsafe, and it had been there long before he even moved in. It was part of the property, a feature that had made him fall in love with the house in the first place. He tried to laugh it off at first, thinking maybe it was a misunderstanding, but their faces stayed serious, and one woman even pulled out a paper that listed supposed rules of the neighborhood. She tapped her finger on a line, claiming that docks were against community guidelines and that he was in violation. The word violation hit him hard. He had barely unpacked his boxes, and already he was being accused of breaking rules. He explained as calmly as he could that the dock wasn't something he had built himself. It had been there for years. In fact, the real estate listing had specifically mentioned the dock, and it was one of the legal features included in the sale of the home. But his words didn't seem to matter. The group shook their heads, telling him that rules were rules, and that they had authority over every property in the community. Frustration began to grow inside him. He had worked too hard for this home to let anyone bully him into giving up the very thing he loved most about it. But at that moment, he also felt uncertain. These people were confident, speaking in firm voices as if they had power over everything. He wondered if he had missed something important in the paperwork when he bought the house. Could it really be possible that they had the right to demand this? That night, he sat in his living room, staring out at the dock, the place that had given him peace only days earlier. Instead of enjoying the view, he now felt a heavy weight in his chest. What if they forced him to remove it? What if he had made the biggest mistake of his life by buying a house that would only bring him trouble? Doubts crept in, and for the first time, he felt uneasy in his new home. The next day, the HOA returned. This time, they were more aggressive. They told him he had a limited number of days to remove the dock or face penalties. They spoke of fines. warnings, and legal action, tossing around words designed to scare him. Their voices carried an air of authority, as though they were untouchable. He tried again to explain that the dock was included legally in the property, and that it wasn't harming anyone. But their ears seemed closed. One man even told him that it didn't matter what the property listing said. What mattered was what the HOA wanted. Anger began to replace his confusion. He didn't like being treated this way, especially by people who were supposed to be neighbors. He had thought he was moving into a peaceful, friendly community, but now it felt like he had walked into a battlefield. He began noticing how their eyes narrowed whenever they spoke, how they looked at him as though he was an outsider who didn't belong. It wasn't just about the dock anymore. It felt personal. Still, he knew anger wouldn't solve the problem. He needed facts. Digging. He pulled out the property documents, the sale agreement, and every paper the previous owner had handed him. He reread them carefully, line by line, searching for any mention of the dock. There it was, written clearly listed as part of the property, approved, and legal. Relief mixed with determination as he realized he wasn't crazy. He had proof on his side. But even with the documents in hand, the HOA continued their pressure. They sent letters to his mailbox, each one demanding the removal of the dock. Some letters were worded politely, but others carried sharp, almost threatening tones. One note even suggested that if he didn't comply, he would face serious consequences. He felt like he was being cornered, pushed into a fight he had never wanted. Late at night, sat on the dock, staring out at the water. The lake was as calm as ever, the moon reflecting in gentle ripples, but his heart was far from calm. Why were they targeting him? Was it because he was new? It's because they thought he wouldn't fight back? The peace he had found in those first days now felt distant. He couldn't shake the image of their stern faces, their demanding voices. Every time he looked at the dock, he no longer saw just a place of peace. He saw the reason for all the conflict. Yet deep inside, a small fire began to burn. He wasn't the type to back down easily. He had worked too hard to get here, sacrificed. Too much to let anyone take away what was rightfully his. If the HOA wanted to fight, then maybe it was time to give them a fight, but on his terms. And with the truth on his side, the confrontation had shaken him, but it also awakened a determination he hadn't felt in years. They had underestimated him, thinking he would simply bow his head and obey. What they didn't know was that he had no intention of losing his dock. What they had started was more than a disagreement. It was a battle between intimidation and justice, and he was beginning to realize that he was ready to stand his ground. Days passed, and the pressure from the HOA did not stop. Each morning when he checked his mailbox, there was another letter waiting for him. Some of them were printed in bold letters, warning him of fines if he did not take down the dock. Others were full of official-sounding words meant to scare him. Even when he ignored the letters, the HOA members themselves sometimes walked by his property, pointing at the dock and shaking their heads as if he were a criminal. What had started as a dream was quickly turning into a nightmare. At first, he felt cornered, but he also knew deep inside that something about this entire situation was wrong. He had bought the property fair and square. The dock was not a secret. It was part of the listing, part of the sale, and part of the life he had imagined for himself. If the HOA claimed it was illegal, then why had no one said anything when the previous owner lived there? Why was the dock suddenly a problem only after he moved in? These questions kept circling in his mind, and slowly, doubt turned into curiosity. And curiosity turned into determination. He decided that if he was going to fight back, he needed the truth. Late into the night, he sat at his desk with stacks of documents spread out before him. The house deed, the inspection reports, the listing papers. He studied them carefully. His eyes caught the section that mentioned waterfront property rights and dock permit. He read it again and again, realizing that the dock wasn't just a random structure someone had built without permission. It was officially registered and approved long ago. There had been paperwork, permits, and even inspections done before. This was no violation at all. The discovery gave him hope. But it also raised another question. If the dock was already approved, Who had the power to decide whether it stayed or not? He began making phone calls, reached out to the city offices, asking about docks and waterways. After being transferred from one department to another, he finally found the right person, the Waterway coordinator. This official was responsible for overseeing every dock, pier, or structure built along the water. If anyone could settle this matter, it was this office. The next morning, he dialed the number again and spoke directly to the coordinator. He explained the situation, telling them how the HOA had been harassing him, claiming his dock was illegal. The coordinator listened patiently, then asked for the property details. After a pause, the coordinator confirmed something that made him smile for the first time in days. The dock was legal. Not only that, but it had been registered properly years before the HOA even existed. The HOA, the coordinator explained, had no authority over waterway structures at all. The weight that had been pressing down on him suddenly felt lighter. The fear, the doubt, the uncertainty, all of it started to fade. But at the same time, a new kind of energy filled him. Anger mixed with relief, because now he knew the truth. The HOA had been bluffing. They had tried to bully him, counting on the fact that he was new, that he wouldn't know his rights, that he would simply give in. But they had miscalculated. When he asked the coordinator what to do next, the answer surprised him even more. The coordinator told him that this wasn't just a personal dispute, it was a misuse of power. If the HOA had been making false claims, trying to control things they had no authority over, then it was serious. The coordinator said they would open an investigation. Hearing the word investigation gave him a rush of satisfaction. For days he had felt small and powerless against the group that stood at his door demanding the dock, but now the situation had flipped. The same HOA that had been threatening him was about to be questioned by someone with real authority. He imagined their faces when they realized they had gone too far, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he felt a sense of victory coming his way. Still, he remained cautious. He knew the HOA would not simply admit defeat. They were proud, controlling, and convinced they had the final say. The following days, they continued their behavior, sending more letters and even warning him that fines were accumulating. He didn't argue with them anymore. Instead, he stayed calm, replying with short notes that said he was reviewing the matter with the proper authorities. He no longer felt the need to shout or defend himself, because now he had the truth and the law on his side. The coordinator, true to their word, began gathering information. They asked him to provide copies of the paperwork showing the dock's permit and ownership. He carefully collected every document and sent them over. Each paper was like a shield, proof that he had done nothing wrong. The coordinator also told him they would be visiting the area to inspect other docks and structures along the water. That part made him curious. Why would they look at the other docks too? The answer would come later, and it would be more satisfying than he imagined. During this time, he often sat on his dock, no longer in fear, but with quiet confidence. The lake hadn't changed, was still calm, still peaceful, still the reason he had moved here. But now, the dock didn't just feel like a place of rest. It felt like a symbol of his stand against unfairness. Each time he looked at it, he reminded himself that no one had the right to take away what was rightfully his. One afternoon, while he was on the dock, a neighbor walked by and quietly stopped to talk. The neighbor lowered their voice and said, "You're not the first one they've done this to." That single sentence told him more than hours of research could have. It meant the HOA had a history of pushing people around, demanding things they had no right to demand. Maybe others had given in because they didn't know their rights. Maybe some were too tired to fight back. But now, with the coordinator involved, things were going to be different. The turning point in his mind was clear. He no longer felt like a victim of the HOA. He felt like someone who was standing up, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been quietly pressured before him. The truth was out, and it was on his side. The HOA might have thought they were powerful, but soon they would realize they had picked the wrong person to mess with. He had found the right ally in the Waterway coordinator, and together they were about to show the HOA what real authority looked like that night. As he sat once again on the dock with the evening breeze brushing his face, he thought about how strange life was. Only a few days earlier, This dock had been a source of stress, almost a curse. But now, it had become the center of his fight for fairness. He didn't know exactly how the investigation would unfold, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't afraid anymore. He had the truth, he had the law, and he had the determination to protect what was his. The battle had turned, and this time, he wasn't the one who would lose. The day of the inspection finally arrived. The Waterway coordinator and a small team of officials came to the neighborhood. They carried clipboards, cameras, and official-looking folders. The man watched from his window as they walked slowly along the lakefront, examining every dock, every platform, every little addition that touched the water. When they reached his dock, he stepped outside to greet them. His heart was calm because he knew he had nothing to fear. The coordinator shook his hand, looked over the structure, and nodded. It was safe, well-built, and most importantly, properly registered. There was no violation at all, but the real surprise came when the officials moved further down the shoreline. As they inspected the other properties, their expressions changed. One dock didn't match the paperwork. Another had an unapproved extension. Some residents had added stairways or boat lifts without permission. Suddenly, the HOA's confident. Voices didn't seem so powerful anymore. The very people who had accused him of breaking rules were now being exposed for ignoring them themselves. Word spread quickly. Neighbors peeked through curtains, whispered to each other, and some even came outside to watch the officials at work. The HOA members who had once stood so tall at his door were now pale and nervous as the coordinator asked them direct questions. When was this addition made? Do you have the proper permit? Their answers were full of hesitation, excuses, and silence. The tables had turned. He stood quietly on his property, watching it all unfold. He didn't shout or gloat. He didn't need to. The truth was speaking louder than any argument he could have made. Every time the coordinator found another unapproved structure, the HOA's authority crumbled a little more. The same people who had written him letters full of threats were now scrambling to explain why they themselves had ignored the rules. By the end of the inspection, it was clear his dock was legal. The HOA's demands had no basis, and worse, many of their own members were in violation. The coordinator gathered everyone and explained the findings. The HOA, he said, had no authority over docks or waterways. Their power stopped at the land, and they had overstepped by trying to control something they had no right to touch. He also announced that several properties would face fines for unapproved modifications, and those owners would be required to fix the issues immediately. The silence that followed was heavy. Neighbors who had been watching exchanged looks, some even smiling quietly. For years, many had felt bullied by the HOA, forced to follow rules that seemed unfair or unclear. Now, seeing the board members caught in their own mistakes, they felt a sense of justice. The man could feel the shift in the air. The HOA was no longer feared. It was exposed. That evening, when the officials left, a few neighbors walked over to him. One shook his hand firmly and said, "Thank you. You stood up when most of us were too afraid." Another admitted that they had always suspected the HOA was abusing its power, but never had the courage to fight. Hearing those words made him realize that his struggle had become bigger than just his dock. He had accidentally started a change. In the community, showing everyone that the HOA was not untouchable, the HOA board members, embarrassed and humiliated, tried to avoid him in the following days. They no longer came marching to his door. The letters stopped. Their voices, once sharp and demanding, were now quiet. He sometimes saw them in the neighborhood, but their confident stride was gone. They looked down as if carrying the weight of their own mistakes. The power they had once held over everyone had been broken by a simple truth that authority means nothing without fairness and legality. For him, the victory was not about revenge. It was about peace. He had never wanted a fight. All he wanted was to enjoy his new home and his dock in peace. But when pushed, he had refused to bend, and that refusal had changed everything. Sitting on the dock at sunset, he thought about the journey. How quickly peace had turned into conflict. How close he had come to losing the one thing he loved most about the property. And how it had all been saved because he chose to seek the truth, instead of giving in to fear. The neighbors began treating him differently too. Where once he was just the new guy, now they saw him as someone strong, someone who stood up for himself and, in a way, for everyone else too. Some even came by to share their own stories of being pressured by the HOA stories, of being told to change the color of their homes, cut down trees they loved, or pay fines they didn't fully understand. It seemed that many people had carried silent resentment for years, but it had taken one newcomer to finally challenge the system. On one quiet evening, as he fished from the edge of his dock, he thought about how ironic it all was. The HOA had tried to take away his peace, but in doing so, they had destroyed their own power. They had hoped to scare him into obedience, but instead, they had been exposed in front of the entire community. And now, every time he cast his fishing line into the calm water, he felt a sense of triumph. Not just for himself, but for every neighbor who could now breathe easier. The HOA still existed, of course, but it was different now. Meetings were quieter, rules were applied more carefully, and the board members spoke with caution instead of arrogance. They had learned the hard way that intimidation could backfire, and that even one person standing firm could shake their entire foundation. The man had become a silent reminder of that lesson. He didn't boast about the victory. He didn't need to. His dock stood there, strong and unshaken, a visible symbol that the truth had won. Whenever he walked past the shoreline, neighbors sometimes nodded at him with a knowing smile. It wasn't just a dock anymore. It was proof that fairness could stand against bullying. That even in the face of pressure, refusing to give in could change everything. As summer evenings grew warmer, he often sat outside with a drink in his hand, listening to the soft waves lap against the wood. Children played nearby, laughter echoing across the water, and the community felt lighter, freer. He thought about how different things might have been if he had simply given up, if he had let the HOA take the dock without a fight. The thought made him shiver, because giving in would not only have meant losing the docket, would have meant losing his peace, his dignity, and his belief in standing for what was right. Now each sunrise felt brighter, each sunset more peaceful. The dock was still his favorite place, but it meant more now than it ever had before. It wasn't just a wooden platform stretching into the lake. It was a story, a memory, a battle won. And every time he walked down its planks, he felt the strength of that victory beneath his feet. When the storm finally passed and the dust settled, he found himself living in a very different neighborhood than the one he had first walked into. The HOA that had once arrived at his door with threats and warnings had gone completely silent. No more letters filled his mailbox. No more stern knocks on his door echoed through the quiet evenings. The lakefront, once a stage 4 confrontation, returned to being what it was meant to be, a place of calm and peace. Yet even in that peace, there was a new kind of strength that lingered. He had not only defended his dock, but also reshaped the way the entire community viewed the HOA. The dock, simple as it was, became more than just wood and nails. To him, it became a symbol of everything he had stood for. Each time he stepped onto it, he felt the pride of having protected it. He would walk across its planks slowly, letting the sound of his footsteps remind him of the journey he had endured. The waves brushed gently against the posts, as if whispering encouragement, as if the water itself had taken his side. Morning, as the sun rose, the lake reflected golden light onto the dock. And he often thought that this was nature's way of celebrating his victory. Neighbors treated him differently now. People who had barely nodded before now stopped to chat. They asked him about fishing, about how he liked the house, about the lake's quiet mornings. One elderly man admitted, almost in a whisper, that he had lived in fear of the HOA for years. They always found something to complain about, he said. The color of my shutters, the way I trimmed my trees. I never had the courage to argue. But what you did gave us all a little hope. That sentence stayed with him. He had not intended to fight for anyone else. He had only wanted peace for himself. But in standing up, he had given others a sense of relief too. People realized that the HOA's power was not as unshakable as it seemed. Rules had limits, and authority without fairness could be challenged. In a way, The dock had saved more than just his evenings on the water. It had saved the spirit of the neighborhood. Still, he did not let the victory make him arrogant. He lived, simply, quietly, enjoying his home just as he had dreamed. On weekends, he sat with a fishing rod in his hands, watching the line ripple across the water. Sometimes children from nearby houses came over to watch, their curious eyes following his every move. He would smile and show them how to hook a line, how to be patient, how to wait for the fish. Their laughter filled the air, blending with the sound of water and birds. Those moments reminded him why he had fought so hard, because life was meant to be lived with joy, not fear. The HOA, though still present, had changed its tone completely. Meetings became quieter, rules more reasonable, and board members more cautious. The ones who had stood at his door demanding the dock rarely made eye contact with him anymore. They avoided confrontation, their pride broken. Longer sent out letters full of threats. Instead, they began sending polite notices about community events or simple reminders. The fear that once hung over the neighborhood seemed to vanish, replaced by a cautious peace. One evening, as he sat on the dock watching the sun melt into the horizon, he thought about everything he had learned. At first, the dock had been only a dream fulfilled, a piece of wood stretching into the water where he could sit and rest. Then it became a source of stress, almost a curse, when the HOA came knocking. After that, it turned into a battlefield, a place tied to anger, letters, and threats. But in the end, it had transformed into something greater. It was no longer just part of his property. It was a reminder that standing up for what was right mattered. Even when the odds seemed against you, the experience taught him lessons he would carry for life. He realized that silence and fear only gave power to those who abused it. Knowledge was the greatest shield. Had he not researched the truth about the dock, he might have given in to their pressure. He learned that fairness does not always speak the loudest, but it is always stronger in the end. And most importantly, he understood that courage was not about fighting for glory. It was about refusing to bow when you knew you were right. Seasons changed, but his feelings never did. In the summer, he sat on the dock with his feet dangling in the cool water. In autumn, he watched the leaves turn gold and fall gently onto the surface of the lake. Winter brought stillness, with ice forming along the edges of the dock, but he still walked out there with a warm jacket, breathing the crisp air. And in spring, when the first flowers bloomed and the lake came alive, again, he felt the same gratitude he had felt the day he moved in. Each season, each view, each quiet moment reminded him that the dock was his safe, secure, untouchable. His neighbors often came to him for advice now, not about fishing or gardening, but about how to handle small disputes with the HOA. He never told them to fight aggressively. Instead, he reminded them to know the rules, to understand their rights, to never give up out of fear. His calm words carried weight because he had lived the lesson himself. People respected him not for shouting or winning, but for standing, quietly and firmly for what was right. Sometimes, when he was alone at night, he thought about what might have happened if he had chosen differently. If he had listened to the HOA's demands, the dock would have been gone. The lake would still be there, but the view would always remind him of surrender. He would sit in his house, looking out the window, and see only loss. His heart would not feel the same peace it did now. That thought always sent a chill down his spine, because he realized how close he had come to giving up Dot. Now when he looked at the dock, he no longer saw wood and water. He saw strength, patience, and truth. He saw the faces of his neighbors, who smiled at him with gratitude. He saw the frightened expressions of the HOA members when their own mistakes were revealed. He saw himself angry, uncertain, but refusing to give in. And most of all, he saw the calm that had returned, stronger than before. Life continued, simple and steady. Each morning began with coffee on the dock. Each evening ended with the colors of the sunset reflecting on the lake. The water was always changing, sometimes calm, sometimes rough, but the dock remained unmoved. Just as he had remained when the HOA tried to tear him down. It was a reminder that peace could be defended, that truth could stand against power, that sometimes one small act of courage could ripple through an entire community like waves across the water for him. It was not about victory anymore. It was about living freely, enjoying what he had earned, and never letting fear steal that away again. And so, day after day, season after season, he walked the same path across the dock. The wood firm under his feet, the water stretching endlessly. Before him, a symbol not only of his home, but of the strength he had found within himself. When a new homeowner refused to bow to his HOA's bullying over a lakeside dock, he uncovered a truth that turned the entire neighborhood against its own rulers.